see how pervasive and how this thread of this thought process has actually really spread right across the economy. And also to draw some lessons from the energizing of different industries, the engagement of different industries in using lean. And the lean story really begins in the over 25 years ago, when the British government invited the Japanese car companies to come to the UK. I remember being at the opening of the Nissan plant in Sunderland, which was the first of the Japanese car plants to open, with Maggie Thatcher opening the plant with all sorts of distinguished visitors. And the plant managers had also invited one of the Geordie line workers who'd been to Japan for training to also speak. And he got up in a very broad Geordie accent. Foreigners won't appreciate, but that's a very comical accent. It gave an absolutely stunning and really funny talk about his experiences of working in Nissan factory back in Japan. And it completely stole the show. It was by far the best talk. It was the talk that everybody remembered. And I kind of thought that was very significant and set the tone. Nissan hired some of a really outstanding management team for that plant that produced one of the best plants in the Nissan empire worldwide. And I remember at the opening of the Toyota plant, which Prince Charles opened, standing with John Kushner, the deputy managing director of Nissan, and we walked around the Toyota plant, and very shortly thereafter the Toyota folks actually were invited to go around the Nissan plant in Sunderland and were really, really surprised how good it was, right from the word go. So we had some really, really powerful demonstration effect that dispelled the myths that this could not be done outside Japan. And that was of enormous significance as we were to discover, to predict, and actually partake in. I saw the collapse of Rover from the inside. I was part of the DTI assessment team for the 1985 corporate plan, which, against Maggie's judgment, was actually approved, gave Rover the K-Series engine that prolonged its life. But despite government help, despite assistance from Honda, and despite assistance from BMW, Rover was never, ever going to ultimately survive. And that was one of the consequences of the arrival of the Japanese. I think, in retrospect, the inviting the Japanese car companies to the UK was probably the most significant industrial policy decision of the Thatcher administration. And it also led to the withdrawal later on of Peugeot Citroën and of much of Ford's operations, although not entirely, because the Harewood plant became a Land Rover plant. At the same time, we did a big benchmarking study of the supply industry to mirror the study we'd done, The Machine That Changed the World, and that also revealed a big gap in the performance of the supply base. And with also an unfavorable exchange rate, ultimately many of those suppliers disappeared, moved abroad, and even Toyota struggled to find good enough suppliers in the main, not just in the UK but across Europe. So GKN was one of the survivors, and you understand why from the presentation that Peter Watkins gave yesterday. Really interesting how long it takes for the implications and the learning to feed back into strategy, to feed back into global redeployment of their production operations. Lean undoubtedly helped the survival of Jaguar from the very, very low point in 1991, when John Egan took over, kind of rescued it, and it also played a role when Ford took it over. There was a big lean program to basically give Jaguar a chance of playing again in the industry, and gradually came together with Land Rover, and Tata has now put in the investment in new models that is now growing. They just announced the other day they're going to add another 1,000 employees. So that's been a big success story. And Lean played a part in moving from a really craft-based, very unimpressive production operation to a very commendable modern operation. The other thing that happened at the time was the bit of the parts department of Rover spun off into Unipart, and we set up a pioneering, first real serious company-wide attempt to deploy lean across that business. The Unipart University was the first corporate university in the country and has had a big demonstration effect right across many, many other industries. Many of people have been to see what lean can do by visiting Unipart. And of course, we've had a very successful Formula One industry for many years, demonstrating, again, a lot of very, very good lean practices. So it's spread throughout the auto industry. But early on, the benchmarking study we did for Anderson Consulting, they funded it, led to the government recognizing that the critical thing to do was quickly to build a set of capabilities amongst the supply base to be able to rescue at least some of the suppliers, and also to build a capability and a cadre of people who could go out and teach others, spread this knowledge to other industries. So we set up the SMMT Industry Forum, which still exists, borrowed 2 engineers from Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and Volkswagen and General Motors to go and work deploying lean in first, but primarily second and third tier suppliers. And that was very, very effective for many years and was later on extended to cover several other manufacturing industries. And it also led to the government developing a manufacturing strategy for the first time, really, that led to the establishment of the Regional Manufacturing Advisory Service in each of the major regions of the country. It still survives in a couple of places, but for a while was extraordinarily effective again at using guest engineers from industry to go into smaller companies that couldn't afford the consulting help that they needed to learn lean, and I think was one of the most significant consequences of those early engagements with lean in the auto industry. So this knowledge then began to spread also into the aerospace industry. Many people left Rover, Lucas, TRW, really to go into the aerospace industry, which really was still very backward and very craft-based, to establish a modern production base, not just at BAE, but also in many of the aerospace suppliers. And the most successful bit of that was probably the Airbus wings plant in Chester, which has grown and grown and grown. And they had a crisis, they've had a couple of crises, but they have developed one of the best implementations of lean in aerospace. And outside the UK, in Hamburg and Toulouse, of course, lean led to the flow line for the assembly of the A320 family, as it did for the Boeing 737. Rolls-Royce also, at the same time, began a program called the 40-Day Engine Program. I remember walking through 5 different facilities, following a fan blade from a titanium casting, all the way through to an assembled fan blade on a big engine in Derby. And that concentrated the mind and showed how difficult and how complicated that supply base was. It was modestly successful. I don't think they ever got to 40 days, but it certainly came down from something like 120, 140, 160 days down to well under 100 days. Rolls-Royce was also able to begin to operationalize the power-by-the-hour concept, which they had developed actually very much earlier, which was basically to sell the use of the engine to airlines and therefore to take over the responsibility for the design and the repair and maintenance and overhaul of the engine. That has become a successful part, a really significant part of the aero engine business thereafter. And the latest manifestation at Rolls-Royce is the 2 plants, in addition to building 2 plants in the States and several more plants in this country and Europe. Rolls-Royce is building 2 facilities to assemble the very, very large engine, the TAE engine, in Singapore, again, on a flow line for the very first time. And this is a very bold venture and a very dramatic venture, and I hope that they will be successful in doing that. But that certainly is the ultimate follow-through of the logic that began with thinking about designing the fan blade in 40 days. Many airlines also began with the repair and overhaul process. Rolls-Royce themselves, but Singapore Airlines, British Airways, Lufthansa, many others also began streamlining the repair and overhaul process for civil aircraft engines, taking the off-wing time from 60 days down to less than 10 in many cases. That was a very big move, and it spread around the world really quickly. It's a very competitive industry. But it also led to the same logic then being extended out into other aspects of airline operations. British Airways had and many other airlines had lean programs in catering operations, in booking, in all of the other aspects of the airline business that we've not really heard too much about in the lean movement, but it's actually been quite pervasive and quite significant. And one of the other very significant programs was, and one of the first programs in the military, mirroring the US Air Force, was designing the repair and overhaul process for Harrier jets and Tornado jets and later on Typhoon jets that again dramatically reduced the time to repair and overhaul and get planes back into combat readiness. That also had a significant effect in actually reducing the requirement for aircraft that needed to be bought, because actually the availability was dramatically improved. And that spread, that led to several other military programs also embodying a lean dimension to the support, the deployment of squadrons overseas, which still happens today, and it spread across several other military programs, including the replenishment of aircraft carriers when we had an aircraft carrier, when they came in to be replenished from one voyage to the next. So it spread really right across the aerospace industry, and still to this day is people in the aerospace industry are still pursuing significant lean programs. Then that led into construction. So John Egan, who was chairman of Jaguar, became the chairman of British Airports Authority and asked myself and Ian Gibson, who was the managing director of Nissan, to join a task force, Deputy Prime Minister's task force, composed of repeat clients repeat customers for construction, from highways, prisons, hotels, railways, retail, etc., etc. And that was a network of repeat clients that were fed up with the construction industry always being late and over budget. And that led to the Rethinking Construction report. We brought a team together, we analyzed what was wrong with the construction industry, and issued a report which is actually probably one of the most significant reports that I was involved in, that was in parallel with the movement for innovation in construction, and there have been several movements thereafter, which was mobilizing pilot demonstration projects in construction right across the country. That had a big impact at the time. BAA themselves began developing partnerships with its suppliers, building the buildings down the North Runway at Heathrow, building piers, making pavements for aircraft parking, and so on. Each of those suppliers began to learn how to work in partnership with BAA, defining the requirements up front so they didn't need to be changed during the process. And I remember sitting in a meeting with John Egan and the chairman of many of these companies complaining that John wasn't changing the specifications of the buildings or the projects, and they weren't able to make any money because he wasn't making any changes. And so he really signaled that actually that this was going to be a different business model from here on. We were going to actually specify. We were actually going to work in partnership to define the specifications. And then we were also going to work together to synchronize the fabrication and build process. And this was in preparation for playing the lead role in building Terminal 5 at Heathrow, which was a remarkable project with 2 on-site fabrication facilities and one access route with up to 1,000 trucks a day coming in and out of that. So the project was one of the largest in Europe at the time and was built on budget and on time. Unfortunately, of course, there was the memorable incident with the baggage handling, which actually was nothing to do with the build process, that upset the launch of Terminal 5. But the lessons from that are now being, although the new owners didn't pursue the same partnership approach that BAA had established, the disciplines of the collaboration to build the new terminal at Heathrow that you will see emerging over the next year or so. It's already very significant. That is all being built on the lessons from Terminal 5. So that's one piece. What happened also is that the team and the contractors, the major contractors, Lang O'Rourke, Balfour Beatty, and several of the others, then took that knowledge and took that collaborative knowledge and that knowledge of how to work with customers to define the build, how to then synchronize the fabrication and assembly process to the rebuilding of the St Pancras station, and then on to constructing the Olympic sites, which, unheard of in the Olympic movement, are not only on time, they're way ahead of time, in fact, and they're also on budget. And now the chairman of Crossrail, who was the BAA, the director of the Terminal 5 project, he's now gone to Crossrail to manage the major Crossrail project across London. So this knowledge has actually spread right across the construction industry, and other repeat clients, such as the Highways Agency, also developed similar initiatives with their contractors building the roads across this country, and prisons and so on and so forth, and the military building houses. So it had actually quite a significant demonstration effect. In parallel with that, the oil and gas industry in the North Sea was beginning to use lean a little bit for the actual construction of offshore platforms, but much more later on for the replenishment of those offshore platforms, which is quite a logistical exercise. And now the government and the Crown Estates are beginning to prepare now for a very significant program of offshore wind, which will only work if the industry can build the capability to build these things in the UK, but at 30% lower than current cost. So there's a massive opportunity for the government to help build an infrastructure in the old shipbuilding areas to learn how to build these massive great turbines using Lean principles to do that with 30% less cost. So the construction industry, of course, has come and gone. The pedal came off, the business came back, and I think the interest in lean waned for a while, but actually is now in the last couple of years, as the crisis has bitten again, the construction industry, they're refinding that Rethinking Construction report and beginning to take those lessons to heart again. And the grocery revolution, quite in parallel with that, began when Tesco in 1995 asked me to help them figure out how to take the lessons from Toyota and so on into the grocery industry. And that led to the development of all of the key building blocks of modern logistics, rapid response supply chain, from replenishing products very rapidly to cross-docking to taking responsibility for primary distribution, for shelf-ready packaging, for all of the other aspects of lean rapid response supply chains that have been a very significant part of Tesco's growth and superior performance over the years. So that supply chain development, plus their ability to not only think back from the customers, but actually through their club card and their home shopping data to actually understand exactly what customers want, led them also to develop the modern convenience stores, which means that you can access the core product range at almost the same prices close to where you live as you can find in the big supermarkets. It also led to Tesco operationalizing across the country home retailing using slack time in their core stores very quickly. It was one of the fastest rollouts of home shopping and has dominated the home shopping business ever since. The discounters, Lidl and Aldi in Germany, who have very significant, have 35% market share in Germany and have tried to penetrate this country and have had some success, with a much smaller product range, have done exactly the same thing, have followed exactly the same lessons that we learned from studying Toyota's parts distribution system in designing Tesco's rapid response supply chain for 1,000 items rather than 30,000 items in a typical supermarket. And many other global retailers are following Tesco's example now of multi-format, of home shopping, of convenience stores, of high street stores, of supermarkets, of hypermarkets, all fulfilled down similar supply chains. So even Walmart now is actually actively building smaller stores closer to customers. We were also involved then in going upstream in figuring out how to break the batch logic of the fast-moving consumer goods industries. And that's not so easy because they were making good margins. On the other hand, being able to demonstrate to them that building small batches of product very frequently, at least every week, if not every day, rather than every 14 weeks, 20 weeks, was a major breakthrough in terms of the operation of the entire supply chain. So supply chains of 100, 120 days could come down to 10 days or less, with very, very significant improvements in performance because you weren't making to such long lead time guesses as in the past. So gradually, Procter & Gamble's, the Unilevers, the Crafts and so on have begun to recognize that this not only leads to supply chain efficiencies, but actually leads to better utilization of their own equipment. And my colleague Ian Glenday really pioneered the methodology for being able to do that, focusing on the few high-volume items, getting them made rapidly, very frequently, and then gradually extending those to the tail of less frequently produced products. And there was also another initiative, again funded by the government, the Department of Food and Agriculture and various different names, to look at, which colleagues at Cardiff did, to look at supply chains right back to the farm for dairies, for meat, for lamb, pork, where we benchmarked the UK supply chains with others in Argentina, New Zealand, etc. And that led to the capability at the Institute for Grocery Distribution, which they've built on a really significant capability in supply chains. They've collected the information and been a hub for sharing of information on best practice supply chains. Then globally, we had an input into the Global Commerce Initiative, which was part of the global industry. It brought together the experts from all of the major global retailers, the Walmarts, the Tesco's, the Carrefours, and so on, with the Coca-Colas and the Procter & Gamble's and so on. There was an initiative in 2006 to collectively create a vision of supply chains of the future. And they issued their first report on Supply Chain 2016 at the time, and they've issued 2 further reports since then. And really the heart of that report was the logic of the lean supply chains we developed for Tesco. So that's actually set the scene and set the agenda for supply chain development across the retail industry, across the world. And that was part of the efficient consumer response movement, which is really a stunning initiative for collaboration between retailers and suppliers that was Europe-focused, the European consumer response movement, but is now renamed and has actually become a global movement, is now the Consumer Goods Forum. And we provided, Alan and I and many others, actually provided some intellectual support for that, both in documenting what was happening, in creating an executive education course for senior leaders in that industry, and for providing input and suggestions for their conferences, and providing the distillation of the best practice and communicating that. So ECR is a really very significant cross-industry movement that has had a profound effect in gradually changing the whole dialogue within that industry, supported right from the very, very top. People like Terry Leahy at Tesco played a very leading role with Coca-Cola and others in creating that movement and sustaining it. It was really quite a remarkable achievement, and it's still very, very active today in shaping thinking across that industry. Many others have also taken lean into the service industry, and we've had many of these stories have been told at our summits over the years. Fujitsu Service at the time did probably the pioneering work in turning call centers into problem solvers, in reversing the logic of low-cost, offshored answering of calls very quickly into putting experts at the end of the phone to really understand the consumer's problem and understand how and where in the supply chain or the information chain things had gone wrong that had generated most of those calls. So actually turning the business into eliminating the needs of the calls by connecting and redesigning the supply chain that was the cause of the call in the first place. And that has been part of the reversing in offshoring that we've also seen in the last few years. Other utilities and telecom companies have redesigned call-out and service response processes using very similar kind of logic, understanding exactly what the customer needs, being able to plan the logistics and the deployment of technicians and so on right across the country. And those things have, I must say, have improved really quite significantly. Meanwhile, banks and insurance companies have streamlined a lot of back-office functions. They started off by trying to streamline and standardize retail operations, but recognized that couldn't work because all the back-office processes were so broken and so unreliable that it just perpetuated chaos at the retail end. And so rightly, they focused on centralizing back-office facilities and using Lean to streamline a lot of those. And I have to say, that's fine, that's wonderful. And when I hear a bank saying we're now able to process a mortgage application in 2 days instead of 17 days, I yawn, Why did it take 17 days in the first place? However, it's very significant. And it's very significant, but frankly not terribly exciting work. So I've kind of stayed away from that work, even though it's been very, very important, and things have got better. But I have to say, I think we're still waiting for the revolution in retail, the utilization of the capabilities that have been built up in back office around redesigning processes before automating them. Still waiting for the revolution in retail banking that I think is going to happen both with the web, but also rethinking the retail customer relationship. I think that's going to happen in the next few years. It really could happen. The biggest impediment to that is I observe that most of the investment banking arms are run by people I recognize as car dealers, people who basically are happier making the next deal rather than sorting out the detail of their processes in the back office, which is the problem in car dealers as well. So maybe the separation of investment banking and retail banking will actually have a positive impact as we free up people to focus on rethinking, taking the examples out of retailing into the banking industry and changing that relationship. And then finally, lean thinking for the NHS, which was a report we published many years ago for the NHS Confederation, the Federation of Hospitals. We at Cardiff trained some of the early folk from the Modernisation Agency, which began to have really quite a significant wake-up call to the hospital industry in this country, the NHS in this country. And together with the head of that agency, David Fillingham, and I, we set up the Lean Healthcare Network, and a couple of years later, the first Global Lean Healthcare Summit in 2007 here. That brought the pioneers together and triggered a lot of interest and really created a huge market for improvement activities and consulting and training right across the system. But I was very aware that from experience of other industries that simply all of that activity focused on point implementation wasn't really going to last. And so we engaged in our own experiments, and you've heard some of the results yesterday, and distilled those in Making Hospital Work. And those end-to-end examples are now showing, I think, the way forward for taking a whole system view of delivering significant results in hospitals. And that also allows us to begin thinking about going beyond what we call the Bermuda Triangle. This is the management triangle that is entirely focused on meeting initiatives coming from the headquarters rather than focused on engaging to sort out the management processes necessary to support the basic operations. As I said yesterday, this is an operations-free zone, so their support is necessary. And we've had great distractions along the way. Government reorganizations, structural reorganizations, attempt to redesign the framework and so on, really put all the lean efforts significantly on hold. And what we actually need now is to be able to free up commissioners and providers to work together to align capacity and demand, and in particular, free them up to innovate, because it's very clear the existing general hospital model is not going to be the model for the future. It's really a relic of the mass production age, and we're going to have to find all kinds of innovative, different ways of providing care in different ways in different places at different times. So, very quick canter through the deployment of lean and how lean has spread right across the economy. We've really almost touched every segment, and there are some that I haven't been able to mention. So it's been a widespread deployment, but what have we learnt from it? First of all, we've learnt that lean only happens when it's driven by a need. The need in the auto industry was very clear. The need in the grocery industry was because Terry Leahy perceived that this is a way he could take his company from an also-ran player into an industry leader, and Tesco is now number 3 in the world. It happened because the construction industry was in such a dreadful state. So it was driven and is only driven by a need, and when the industry gets fat and happy again, they pay a bit less attention to lean. Well, that's not surprising, but that's true. And the second is that you need pioneers. Without a pioneer to demonstrate proof of concept projects and results and to illustrate the opportunities, you get nowhere. And so that's why the process of taking lean into an industry really is governed by the speed by which we can find a willing pioneer, willing to stick their neck out, willing to try, and follow through to demonstrate the results. With that, as we had with Tesco in the retail industry, you can do a tremendous amount. BAA, I think, provided that role in the construction industry. The third, I think, key is always taking a systems perspective. While we in the lean movement have spent a lot of time down in redesigning processes, I've always started by thinking about the whole process, thinking about the whole healthcare process, thinking about the whole retail process, thinking about the whole construction process, because unless we see it as a system, it's very difficult to see exactly how to diagnose where the system is being disturbed, and I will talk a bit about that later on. So we need a systems perspective, and the top needs to understand how their system is currently working, which is why taking an executive walk, a Gemba walk with the senior Tesco managers was such an eye-opening experience and really triggered that whole movement. So we need that understanding at the top. We need to work end-to-end. Absolutely, this has to be following the horizontal flow of value creation and building a solid problem-solving foundation, which we've been talking about. And the fourth lesson is that I've seen so many well-intentioned, consultant-led initiatives fail. And I conclude from that my experience is that the only things that last are the things that people do themselves. We have, too, made that mistake several times of designing the answer without actually allowing people to design their own answers and guiding them in doing so. So building your own capabilities is absolutely fundamental. And also recognizing that these are line management responsibilities. And so it isn't the number of Kaizens you do, it's how many line managers you've got who can run a logistics operation, a production operation, or a healthcare operation, who can run them in a lean way and do all the coaching and build all the problem-solving infrastructure. So it's a line manager responsibility. And finally, there is a very significant and growing issue which I think people are beginning to wake up to, and that's the problem of the bun fight at headquarters. I have visited many golden, silver glass palaces often in a beautiful location next to a lake, and not always, but often next to a lake, that remind me of castles, that remind me there's a king here and there are a lot of barons, and there are a lot of knights that I usually get involved in the meetings armed with PowerPoint. And they are there to defend their territory and to make sure that nothing actually really happens. And shame on them. Sometimes this is the central lean team as well. And initiatives get lost in the fighting at headquarters. And I think this is a growing problem that we're not facing up to, and is going to limit our ability in very big companies to take the initiatives we need to. So I'm serious about it. I think what I've observed in those companies is behavior from senior executives to their staffs that you would never dream of doing back on the shop floor. So it's a serious problem. And the fifth one, and I think this is actually very important. In addition to having the pioneers, what you also need to do is create a kind of shared vision about where the industry as a whole is going. And so from the ECR movement, but also from the Rethinking Construction movement, where you begin to engage the senior executives or the leaders of the industry in thinking, in sharing an understanding of the goals and the achievements that need to be done, then you can begin to build the learning and collaboration that's necessary. For instance, with the offshore program, the offshore wind program, it's going to need the energy companies, the contractors, plus the building of a whole supply chain. It's going to need really, collective effort involving government to actually align and to make sure we can build all the capabilities that will build a successful industry. So I think there are interesting lessons to be learned from the spread of lean right across industries, and I don't think this is the end. I think there's a lot more to come.